for the Guillermo Democracy Award. Catalina Smolovitz, Susan Stokes, Scott Mainwaring, and Gabriela Ippolito-O'Donnell, who is going to be joining us online from Buenos Aires. Grateful to all the nominations that were sent in. We had a huge pool of excellent nominees, and I'm going to quote liberally from the 6 nominators who nominated our honor end this year. But before we do that, some of you may know that the co-creator of this award, along with Gabriela, was our late friend Kevin Middlebrook, who had such an important role in this association, having served as treasurer and held many other LASA leadership roles. And we thought we would, given that Kevin sadly passed away 6 months ago in London, we thought we would begin the session just with a short testimonial from Gabriela about Kevin. So I'm going to turn to Gabi in Buenos Aires for a few moments. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for us in the South. And thank you, team, for inviting me to this session. Thank you for being such a terrific chair of the selection committee. And thank you, most importantly, for 35 years of friendship that we are celebrating in 2023. And congratulations to Terry for this so well-deserved award. It is an honor for the family and for myself that she has accepted the award, and I know that Guillermo today would be really, really happy. Tim asked me to say a few words in memory of our mutual friend and colleague, Kevin Middlebrook, who passed away on November 20. If we are here today celebrating this award in memory of Guillermo and Terry's academic achievements, it is because of Kevin. We met briefly in LASA in Chicago in 2014, and it took just 30 minutes for us to decide to work together on this prize, that it had to be about Guillermo, about democracy, and he insisted it had to be at LASA. And you could not imagine the hours that Kevin put about this prize. He spent endless hours drafting memos, designing rules, looking for funds. And he was incredibly generous with his time and also financially, like many others, contributing to the award. And it took 3 long years. When I thought that this was not going to happen, he always had the right words to cheer us up, always positive and always looking for alternatives. And I asked one day Kevin why he was so committed to this award. You know, it was very clear for me, my motivations. And he told me, and I know that there are some graduate students at the floor, that he, as a graduate student, became involved in the transitions from authoritarian rule project. And he was the rapporteur of 2 of the Wilson Center conferences that launched and organized these projects. And later on, he was one of the authors of the volumes, the volume on Latin America that I have here, and that Guillermo specifically organized. And he was the author of the article on Mexico, political liberalization in an authoritarian regime. He said that this experience as a graduate student, as a young political scientist, was so influential in his career. It was a building block that he felt he had to do something about Guillermo and about democracy and about LASA. I talked to Kevin a few weeks before he passed away, and we had started working on a new big project that I'm afraid is not going to happen without his driving force and his commitment. Let me finish remembering Guillermo with Kevin's own words. You know, he sent me a letter in March of 2012 after Guillermo passed away, and I will pick just a couple of lines about him. And he says, what was particularly inspiring of Guillermo, however, was his deep personal commitment to democracy and social justice, and his insistence on keeping these values at the forefront of academic research. I was always especially impressed by Guillermo's grace in his interactions with students and younger professional colleagues. Guillermo's courage, kindness, and humanity set an example for all of us. We will all miss him immensely. With warm regards, Kevin. I think that these words also apply to Kevin, those of us who had the great fortune to work with him or share some moments with him in any capacity know that this is totally true. We will all miss his professionalism, his service to the profession, and some of us, his friendship. I congratulate Terry again for this very well-deserved prize. I hope to see you all in Buenos Aires at the end of July for the IPSA-SAP Congress. And Tim, thank you again for inviting me to this session.
Thank you. I'm going to sit next to the honorand because I might get a bit emotional here. So I'm honored to introduce the recipient of this year's Guillermo O'Donnell Democracy Award and Lectureship. Terry Lynn Karl is the Gildred Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Latin American Studies at Stanford University. She received her PhD from Stanford with distinction and then was an assistant professor at Harvard before returning to Stanford in 1987, which coincidentally is the first year I met her when I was a nervous young grad student at the Kellogg Institute in my first year of grad school. There at Stanford, Terry served as director of the Center for Latin American Studies for 12 years. She currently works as a war crimes and human rights investigator and expert witness in both civil and criminal cases in the United States, Spain, and Latin America. Her current research discusses the utility of war crimes trials for historic memory and popular culture, as well as focusing on fossil fuels, authoritarian rule, democratization, and war. The Guillermo O'Donnell Democracy Award has two award criteria, which is quite interesting. First is outstanding scholarly production in the area of democracy studies, and the other is the de facto advancement of democracy in the region. We've had honorands of both types, but Terry Karl excels not in one, but both of those criteria. I will mention only a few highlights on each of the two dimensions. Her 1997 book, The Paradox of Plenty, showed us how natural resource wealth can undermine democracy using the crucial case of Venezuela. Her 1990 article in Comparative Politics identified several different modes of transition and speculated on eventual long-term regime outcomes. Her 1991 article with Philippe Schmitter in the Journal of Democracy, What Democracy Is and Is Not, is a classic that is mandatory reading in every comparative politics syllabus around the world and is a classic of concept formation in political science. She's one of the originators of the concepts of electoralism, or democracy as mere elections, and hybrid regimes. And she's also published widely on the role that pactos políticos, can play in democratization, as well as on the harmful consequences of inequality for democratic regimes. Terry Karl is also a politically engaged scholar who has promoted democracy and human rights in Latin America. She has provided expert testimony, such as reports and affidavits, which have led to the conviction and extradition of Salvadoran military officers for systematic human rights crimes, including torture and murder. Her work has resonated far beyond El Salvador, far beyond Latin America, to open new legal pathways to build to hold human rights violators to account. And based on her extensive research for these trials, she's currently working on a new book on how the human rights trials can shape historical narratives, truth, and memory. All of this has been on a pro bono basis, of course, if you know Terry. Terry is also, she's a tremendous,
Justice.
not for the Department of Justice. Okay, well, I'm glad that my tax dollars are going somewhere good. Terry Karl, as you know, is a tremendous producer of public goods that make the world a better place. And as many of you in the room will know, this goes well beyond democracy. Another struggle in Terry's life was the subject of a panel at LASA 5 years ago. By my reckoning, the best attended session at the best attended LASA ever in Barcelona. And those of us who were there in that room were witnesses to her dignity and grace, which have undeniably improved the lives of women in academia and which have undeniably improved the association to which we belong. It turns out that historical memory was very important for LASA as well. Terry alerted us to so much, and we're grateful for her courage and for her example. She's also a legendary teacher and mentor, supervisor, and friend. So many people in the room, I can see nodding, have benefited from her mentorship. And she's a particularly fitting recipient for this award, given that she and Guillermo were driven by the same concerns for democracy and the rule of law. Guillermo, it should be said today, was a friend and mentor to Terry, and we'd be absolutely delighted to see this assembly today. So we're pleased to name a first-rate scholar and a first-rate human being as the recipient of this year's Guillermo O'Donnell Democracy Lectureship. Terry Lynn Karl.
Thank you so very much. And thank all of you for coming in these COVID times. Lower? Can you see me? I just first wanted to just say a caveat. I'm not going to really talk about war crimes here, but I'm happy to entertain any questions and answers or any comments from some of you who I know have studied or worked on war crimes that are in the room. I had to get back into democracy in Latin America because of this prize. I've currently been working on Russia and the Ukraine. And I wanted to sum up a couple of things that I found first before I go into an area that is a very new one for me. So I would really appreciate comments on what you have to say. Most of you know some of you know what I've worked on before, and this is a new endeavor. But not first. First of all, I just wanted to say something about the democracy debate itself. And if Guillermo O'Donnell and Albert Hirschman were here, definitely two of my most important mentors, and two who were absolutely formative, not just in my career, but saving my career for some of you who know the Harvard story. They would both be sitting here. I can just hear them. I can see Albert, I can see Guillermo going, oh my God, here we go again. And I can hear them saying there's something cyclical about these moments of authoritarian rule and these moments of democratization. And here we go again, right? That this cyclical idea was something that we didn't really understand when we did the Transitions to Democracy project. And I do want to say that there's a panel on that later this afternoon, but it's very important to say to people who are looking at that project today that there was not a single democracy except Costa Rica, I believe, when we initiated that project or when they initiated that project. And the other thing I want to say about that is there wasn't a single democracy in Southern Europe either. And it was the first comparative Southern Europe, Latin America project, very, very fundamental in that way. And what it did for us was what we called hopeful wishing. We were hoping that authoritarian regimes would crumble, which they did. And we were also hoping that we didn't talk about this, that the replacement would be some form of democratization. I shouldn't say we didn't talk about it. We talked about it, but that wasn't the outcome that we necessarily thought was going to happen. So that means that regime breakdowns and changes in this cyclical Latin American and American pattern of going between democracy and authoritarian rule is something that, even though it has some very structural components to it, we all believe was very contingent, that the actions of people at those moments mattered a huge amount, whether they headed towards authoritarian rule and reinforced that, or whether in fact those actions were moving us all towards democracy. We were very well aware that democracy was what we called a vessel of aspirations, that this is what everybody put their hopes in, that somehow changing towards democracy would change everybody's lives for the better, not just their polities, but their lives. But we were also fully aware, and I think this is really important to underline, that democracy involves a fierce, often quite nasty, and sometimes dirty competition for power. Democracy might be aspirational, but it's also down deep and dirty in political competition and in trying on the progressive side to push change and on the conservative side to contain it. We all know that, but we have to remember that that's what democracy is. It's a fierce struggle for power. When I looked at the record of Latin America at this time, I thought there was a good story and a bad story. I'm going to say this very quickly because so many of you know these stories better than I do. I need a slide. Where is she? Oh, slide. No, second one. Sorry. There you go. I'm trying to show you this because even though probably the level of support for, or people who say they support their democracy in the Americas seems to be at one of its lowest ebbs ever, what you really see is that there hasn't been a whole lot of change. And if you look over time, the fact is, and this is, I think, a good story, that whatever people say they think about their democracies, it's not necessarily what happens to democracies. And with the exception of the 2008 financial crisis, and this is something to remember because financial crises are super important in this story, this is especially true that this has been a fairly steady kind of support for democracy. If you look at the next slide, what you'll see also is that, well, you won't actually see it in this slide, but what I want to say about this slide is that democracies, especially in Latin America, have been far more durable, competitive, and increasingly inclusive than we really thought. And for those of you who are in the back, what you see here is the direction of democracy, in the dark blue. You see what we call electoral democracies still in the blue, and I won't go into these categories and how this was done. This is not my slide. You'll see electoral authoritarian regimes that we see in Latin America, but also all over Eastern Europe and other places. And then finally, you see autocratic regimes. And what you see from that slide, and if you look at the years, it's from 1789 to almost the present, is you can see the gradual increase in something that we don't really think all the time that that's what's happened. And that's a very good story. The other piece of that story that I think is very good is the experimentation and the growing inclusion in Latin America. And I'm not going to say very much about that either. I think there are a lot of panels on that. But one of the things that's so important about Latin America is that we've seen this huge number of institutions, of mechanisms, of digital democracy, of deliberative democracy, of innovations in democracy, of innovations in gender, in innovations in especially in indigenous representation, et cetera, in direct voting. All of these things are happening in democracy. And it's very important for those who are working on democracy in the current time to realize that those big indices of Freedom House and others do not capture those innovations. So there can be a lot more happening on the ground than anybody really knows. I think that's the good story that we see. I should add the environment to that list. The not so good story, could we have the next slide? The not so good story is in the north. It's Central America and Mexico. And I don't find this very surprising. If those of you know that I worked on rents for a long time, rents are excess profits, essentially. I thought at the time they were just oil, but now every form of criminality you can think of, from trafficking of people to trafficking of drugs to a whole range of criminal activity. I would include mining as a somewhat different story, but debt, foreign aid, all of these things are what we call rents. And that means it's money that you reap what you did not sow. There's no necessarily productive activity that accounts for the excess profits in that. And it is not surprising to me that those countries in Central America, Mexico, and the Andes that live off of different form of rents have much worse quality of democracy or even prospects for democracy than the countries of the Southern Cone because of the rent phenomena. The second thing I'd say about rents is that rents and violence go together. The whole point of capturing rents is to often have armed groups that will capture rents. And so what we're seeing in the northern part of Latin America is the corruption around rents and the going together of private military forces linked sometimes and sometimes not to public military and security forces. And then in turn, one or the other or both linked to politicians. Now, we've all seen that in different countries, and we've seen it if you follow the drug routes, but that is a trafficking story. It's not just a story of how contracts are awarded or anything else, although that is piece of the Ranche story as well. And what that means is that you have extraordinary levels of violence in places where this is the case. And I'm showing you this slide. This is a slide I use in the trials I've been in, because I need to educate people who sometimes, especially when trials are in Florida, who they know about the dirty war in Argentina, they may know about Pinochet in Chile, but they do not know anything about Central America. And I used this slide in a trial with El Salvador, because what it does is it shows you how great the difference in violence is in the North compared to the South. And the reason I'm showing you that is that when I was in those countries during the civil wars, you could see the corruption already. You could see the trafficking already. You could see everything that we see today was already in place, and it was not just it was not dismantled in any way. And I think that's something it's really important for us to know about, because this region is different. It means that we're thinking about a region that has very different dynamics going on with it. The next thing I want to talk about is really the challenge that I see for democracy today. So if that's the case, that you have all this innovation in the South, and I want to talk about the challenge, I think the real challenge is how to turn liberal democracies, which are based on individual rights and individuals, into what I've called diverse democracies. And by that, I mean democracies that can guarantee, and I'm not going to read the slide, but they basically guarantee the rights of every person living inside the territory and every group. And this is, we have never seen a democracy like this. And so never. And in any country you can think of. And so the key question is, can our real existing democracies today, those that actually exist, can they transform into something that is a diverse democracy in which all citizens can be treated fairly, and they can, in fact, have their group and individual rights respected? We have not, as I said, seen that before, which brings me to the area that I haven't ever talked about before. And that has something to do, it's not true I've never talked about it before, but it's never been the center of what I'm going to say. And that is that if you want to switch from liberal democracies, and I can explain more about what I mean by liberalism later, to these kind of diverse democracy, what you really have to do is think differently, I believe, about identity politics. And when I say think differently, identity politics, at least in the United States, has always been defined as describing the identities of historically marginalized groups. That's what it's come from. That's where it's grown. And I think that's actually a mistake, because I think everyone in this room has an identity. And I think that identity may be a progressive identity, it may be a reactionary identity, it may be a Black identity, it may be a white identity, excuse me, it may be Christian, it may be Jewish, it may be Muslim, but we all have identities. And what research shows is that those who engage politically are much more concerned about the threat to their identity. This is very, very important, because people who are engaged politically do not act or think or even have the same attitudes as people who are disengaged politically. And anybody who's done any organizing knows this is true. It's a different way of thinking. So what we see is that our identities shape our worldview, our values, sometimes where we live, our class, our religion, our engagement in politics or not, our race, which may not be chosen, or our ethnicity, and that these identities are not singular. Every one of, if we went around the room, we'd all have various identities. And what really matters is what happens when these identities coalesce in what I call a mega identity. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily subordinate identities or even dominant identities, if I can put it that way. But what happens when they coalesce in a mega identity? And what I mean by that is an identity that is linked to politics and is overriding. So it has to be an identity linked to a political party, linked to an NGO, linked to a person, and it overrides all of our other identities. They all become subsumed in it. Now, we know identities in a different way in Latin America and in the United States. We know that Christian white elites have dominated politics from the colonial period onward. And we also know that they had strategies of domination. We know they had strategies of whitening. We know they had strategies of segregation. We know they had strategies of violence, et cetera. And we also know that this occurred very differently between the United States and Latin America. And I don't really have time to go into much of this, but it happens differently, partly in immigration policies. And if you look back, remember that Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay had absolutely clear immigration policies to attract the Irish, to attract the Italians, and they did it purposely because they wanted white people to civilize whomever was already living there. That was the point of it, and it was a deliberate immigration whitening policy. Now, if you know about that policy, you will know later why whites in the United States think that the immigration policies today are deliberate as well, and why they talk about the Great Replacement. And I'll come back to that in a minute, in a little bit. The thing about the whitening and later intermarriage and the difference between the United States and Latin America is that you're 105 times more likely to have a mixed marriage in Brazil than you are in the United States. That's a stunning statistic to me. So in the United States, the rigidity of the way we did things in the United States is greater, and it doesn't have the same kind of components. The other thing I want to show you in this is the next slide, please, is the movement of peoples. And the thing that's so important about the movement of peoples is that this is not just a US phenomenon, people coming to the United States or Europe anymore. This is all over the world. And while I can't do all of the movements of peoples, if you look at the numbers in the slide, and you look at countries like Sweden, who always define themselves as a mono-ethnic, monocultural society, and then suddenly is finding that that's not possible anymore, what you see is that the movement of peoples is adding to this problem that we have of, and I'm going to call it a problem for a moment, and I don't mean that judgmentally, but the problem is, how do you turn, again, liberal democracies into diverse democracies when the diversity is increasing so rapidly that it's threatening dominant groups? And I mean, that is the challenge that I believe many of us face. Now, when I talk about mega identities, it means that parties and politics and NGOs even, they act as a sort of sorting mechanism, if I can put it that way. So that it used to be, if you were a Republican or a Democrat in the United States, for example, you used to be able to talk to each other. But now it's a way of life. And that's for politically engaged people. I'm talking about politically engaged people now. And when I say it's a way of life, it means that it becomes a mega identity that subsumes underneath it religion, what kind of car you drive, what kind of coffee you drink, whether you go to this place or that place, what kind of religion you have. And in my country, at least, this has become geographic, which is always a very dangerous thing. It means you have red states and blue states, something we never had before in the United States. Two more points on the identity question. One is, and I've said this before, is that disengaged people act differently. And in places where the institutional arrangements increase engagement on both sides, you're going to have much greater polarization. So that's what you're seeing, for example, in the United States, because it's in the primaries where we see the most engaged people voting. Other countries don't have primaries in that way. And what that does is it polarizes mega identities even more. And there are other institutional arrangements that I could talk about that do that. Now, what's so important about that is that for those of us who were graduate students a long time ago, what we learned was that cross-cutting identities, when you had lots of identities and they cut across each other, was a form of not having conflict. It was a form of tapping down conflict because there were cross-cutting identities. And what we're seeing now in the creation of what I call mega identities is that it's counterintuitive, but a mega identity is far more dangerous than a lot of identities running around. It's far more dangerous and it's far more of an opportunity. I should say that as well. So let me go to the next slide. And I want to show you, a lot of you know this already, so I'm going to go over this very quickly, but I'm going to go over it in a different way in what I say in the slides, because I'm not reading the slides. I actually wasn't going to be a Latin Americanist. I was going to work on Germany. And I did do a lot of work on Germany. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the warnings that come from the Weimar Republic. Now, I don't know how many people here ever studied the Weimar Republic or knows about it, but I'm just going to highlight a few things. This is the democracy that existed in Germany before the rise of Hitler. So the Weimar Republic was considered a state-of-the-art democracy. It was the only democracy in Europe that had equality between men and women, for example. It was a state-of-art democracy. It had gay rights. I can go on and on about all the things that it had, but it ended. And it ended in ways that most of us know about. I'm going to talk about the early Hitler, and I'm talking about the early Hitler, not because I'm comparing anybody to Hitler. I want to be very clear about that. But because the early Hitler has things that it's going to sound familiar to some of you. The early Hitler was a leader who was greatly underestimated. Nobody thought he was ever going to be what he was and what he became. He was actually convicted of treason, and he went to jail. He went to jail, and the reason he went to jail was that he attempted a violent coup that didn't work. And he was sent to jail for treason. He was released very soon because the conservatives around him thought he was a front man and a controllable force. He was somebody they could control. And in fact, it turned out the other way, that he was much smarter, much better than they thought he was. The other thing I want to highlight for those of you who work on democratic institutions is that Weimar had been a parliamentary system. And most people treat it that way, but if you look at it very carefully, what happened is they put in force something called Article 48. And Article 48 effectively changed the Weimar Republic from a parliamentary system to an ultra-presidentialist system. So that when Hitler comes into power, there's already an ultra-presidentialist system in place. I want to say a few more things about the Weimar Republic. What was so effective in it, as we know now, was the big lie. The big lie and the use of propaganda to create what we might call today a fake news story. That's where all of this originated. That's where the technology is from this. And it's very important that that was so successful. It was based first on conspiracy theories and on news that was aimed directly at the most vulnerable in society, those who were suffering the most, those who didn't have jobs, those who had lost, who were disillusioned from their experiences in war, et cetera. This is very important because it wasn't an accident that it went there first. It was a deliberate policy. And finally, I want to say that all of this was combined with the first targets of creating the notion of the outsider. the person who didn't belong in the community, the group that didn't belong in the community. We know that was Jews, and it was especially Jewish immigrants arising, coming from Eastern Europe. Now that wasn't in the cards originally, but the creation of the other was very, very important in this. And it gets back to some of the identity questions I'll talk about in this. He also originated what I call, and others have called, the authoritarian playbook. And the authoritarian playbook, which you have up there, is a playbook that was originated by the early Hitler. It is a playbook that has been modernized, but it has exactly the same types of strategies. It's very important to know this because Hitler shows you, of course, what something like this can turn into in its most awful form. But it also shows you what the playbook is. And that playbook is to slowly and gradually accustom citizens to the institutions of liberal democracy, and then use those institutions to concentrate executive power, tell big lies, quash dissent, centralize power in the presidency, and end democracy. That's what it is. And when you look at that, that playbook, you see it everywhere. You see it in Turkey, you see it in Hungary, you see it in Brazil, you see it among some of the conservative politicians that are now vying for power in Latin America and places like Chile and other places. They're following the same playbook. And there's two things that I want to say about that playbook. First of all, it's gradual. It is not fast. It is gradual. Secondly, they use what we call salami tactics. And if you can think of a salami, it means you slice away at democracy. The language I use is salami tactics. It's been modernized by Russia, Venezuela, Hungary, the Philippines, Nicaragua, Turkey, and today in El Salvador, and you will see it in the United States as well. So this is very important to know. It is also very important to know that the same people who know this salami tactics go from country to country. So somebody yesterday told me that Steve Bannon, I think, was in Brazil. I think he might be in Chile. I do not know. But these are the same advisors that cross around the world to show people how you do, show leaders how you do these kinds of things. Let me turn now, having said that, to what I call, or to what I've learned about how attitudes turn into violence. It's clear that my preoccupation is that the change from liberal democracy to a diverse democracy is a very dangerous moment, and that it can be a very violent moment, which we all know because we know histories of domination and subordination. What you see is, and I have spent a lot of time on this, is that Hitler could have been dismissed as an aberration. But what you cannot dismiss is the millions of ordinary people who turned into murderers. And that is super important. It was actually the basis for psychologists, most of them Holocaust survivors, to start the study of social psychology. And what social psychology told us is that the salami tactics that I'm talking about is the study of how humans interact with each other and how attitudes turn to violence. It's an area that we don't work in usually, but it's a very important area. It has been for me. Let me illustrate some of their findings, and I'm going to do this by using some of my court cases. I mean, first of all, for individuals, what we now know that we didn't know before is that there are, and I'm talking about individuals now, not collectivities, is that people can be divided into those who are more open to change and those who are more fear-based about change. We know this. And we know that those who are more fear-based about change are people who are often, not always, by the way, but often much more aggressive in their daily life. So you can actually begin to identify qualities on the individual level. I'm just talking on an individual level in their everyday life. And what smart authoritarians know is how to target these people as their followers and also how to trigger their anger even greater. That's very, very important in the stories that I'm gonna tell in a moment. The other thing we know is that when you look at both individuals and collectivities, and this has been very important for me in trying to understand some of the things I've seen in court cases or in my my research trying to find perpetrators and understand them. On the collective level and on the individual's level, there's something called moral disengagement. This is a very important concept if you study violence. And moral disengagement is the way you get an ordinary person to commit violence and to harm somebody else. That's the way you do. It's the process by which you get ordinary people to harm others. What's so important about this, and again, it's called moral disengagement. What's so important about this is that it's also a gradual process, and it involves in hierarchical organizations. Can I have the next slide, please? When you're trying to, this is a slide I took. This is El Mozote in El Salvador. These are the children. Over half of the 1,000 people who were killed in this village are children. And it takes a lot to try to figure out how an ordinary soldier can kill children. And this is what why moral engagement becomes so important, because it's the process by which an individual and a collective organization as well rationalize what they do so that it's okay. And so they can live with themselves. For hierarchical organizations, it has to do with the leadership of that organization. It can be, you can be looking at one battalion who will do it and the other one won't. And that will come down to whether the leader is morally disengaged or not, or whether he just can't bring himself to do this. Part of the explanation of this is gradualness. Again, I really want to talk about the gradual changing of people. Can I have the next slide? This one is from a court case of mine, and I was trying to show the rise of violence in El Salvador. You don't have to know the story, but what it shows is, and you really don't want to be in that red-orange area. You just don't want to be there. And what it shows you is, and this was turned out to be a very important slide for a lot of reasons, it shows you a pattern of gradualness. And what's so important about that pattern of gradualness that I used in the trial, this was against General Garcia, I could show why it went up and why it went down. And I won't, I won't do that right now, but I want to show you what happens in that story and how gradual it is. What's so important, what I really want to share with you is not the story of El Salvador, but is the story of how that happens. And it starts always with the vilification of what I call the out group. That can be Jews in Germany, it can be communists in El Salvador, it can be indigenous people in Colombia fighting, or a group of indigenous people fighting a mining thing. But what you need to do is find an out group and vilify it. And what the importance of that vilification is that vilification grows over time until people think that the other, whoever it is subhuman. It's just not a member of the human race. That's the beginning of all of this. They're not a member of the human race. I heard subhuman so many times. And not only are they subhuman, but they're going to take over what all of you have. So they're not human and they're taken over. The second thing that you see is the leader, whether it's a military leader or a president, has to claim that the moral good is worth it. So you're saving the nation, you're saving the white people, you're saving whoever you're saving. You're defending the country against communism, whatever the other is. So I'm trying to talk in generalities here, but you have to have that. There has to be a good end. So if I'm going to torture any of you, I have to know I'm doing it for a good end, that this is worth it in a sense. And the third thing that happens in this process, you have vilification, the claims of good, et cetera. The third thing that I've seen, this is my list really, is the rationalization that what you've done is okay. And that is both a collective and an individual rationalization I found. It means that you have to minimize the harm you've just caused. So if you remember that slide with all those children's ages on it, what you see when you go to interview the soldiers that were part of that massacre is, as I said to my friend here, I said, you know, I've never interviewed a soldier who was actually killed a child. So, I mean, they all just died. And the reason they never kill a child is they're guarding the backpacks, they're getting the water, they're helping their leader climb over the hill. They're carrying a gun, but they don't use it. I mean, that's what I mean about the rationalization, post-rationalization. What's stunning about that is if you work on massacres that happened 40 years ago, everybody believes their story. So that rationalization becomes your narrative, and it becomes the narrative of the institution. Finally, this is very important because leaders do this too, whether they're military presidents or whomever. And if they're not psychopaths, because I'm not talking about psychopaths now, they don't have to morally disengage because they're already morally disengaged. But if you're an ordinary person and you are being tried, I think there's differences between some of the perpetrators that I've been involved in either catching or trying. Some of them I actually think are psychopaths, but some of them aren't. Some of them are normal people that went through this process that I'm talking about. And what's so striking about these people is that they develop in court what I call a scale of deniability. I don't have enough time to really show you this, but I use it in court a lot. And that is where you shift the blame to somebody else. So the scale is actually more complicated than that, but the bottom line is somebody else did it, not me. So in the massacre of El Mozote, for example, which is the largest massacre in contemporary Latin American history, in that massacre, in the end, it just didn't happen. And then when there was finally 20 years later, forensic digs of the children, and you couldn't deny it anymore, the argument was it was a cemetery of the guerrillas, because the guerrillas did it, and they used to kill kids all the time and probably ate babies, I don't know. But the bottom line of this is there's a whole process you have to go through to turn attitudes into violence. And the last thing I want to say in the social psychology, there was an amazing Polish social psychologist whose name was Henri Tajfel. And Henri Tajfel said, he did all these incredible experiments, and his bottom line was that out-group discrimination and violence is remarkably easy to trigger. That's what he said. That's his conclusion. Now that brings me to the United States. And I'm sorry, I'm not talking about a Latin American democracy here, but I am going to talk about the United States. And I'm not going to do US history. Can we have the last slide, please? First of all, what's happening in the United States is extraordinary demographic change. And you can read that demographic change, but it's actually much better to look at it. And if you get to the next slide, these are just statistics about what's happening in the United States. Demographers call it the browning of America. Could you go to the next slide? The browning of America. The red is white people. And the rest is the rest. So, and how fast it's changing. And what you see here is this extraordinary change in the United States. Rapidly, that this change is quick, that we know the United States is no longer a model, but it is the most multi-ethnic society now and multiracial society in the world. It has the fastest immigration rate. It has taken the most immigrants. And if you are a rural white man who has a high school education or less, you believe that these people who are coming in is part of a deliberate conspiracy to replace you. It's called the Great Replacement. And that's what you believe. That's a very conspiratorial thing. You can follow it all the time. Mr. Trump uses it all the time. And that's what the belief is, that this is a deliberate immigration policy. It isn't. Some of it is, but not much of it. And it's not a whitening policy, obviously, anymore. That's very different. And this has a profound impact on what democracy is and is not in the United States, what it could look for and look like, and why we are no longer, I think, considered a model. Now, I want to give some apologies here to Latin Americans in the room, because frankly, the only thing that matters to the United States in terms of policy right now is trade with Mexico and immigration. And well, drugs and immigration are actually tied together in a certain way, but nothing else matters. So what's happening in Latin American democracies, there's nobody studying the innovations of Latin American democracies. There's nobody really who it makes a difference in US policy that Central America is moving in a certain form of authoritarian playbook. This is just not part of the whole policy agenda. And what all this means is that this is a dangerous moment, a very dangerous moment in the United States, I would argue, particularly around the elections of 2024, before and after, by the way. And when I say that it's dangerous because of the changing demographics in the United States and the way that is being portrayed positively and negatively by mega identities. So I just want to end the US part. Could I have the next slide? By just saying, this is a cartoon. It's an amazing cartoon, and I won't go into everything. I'm not going to tell you about US history and the Indian Wars and this war and that war, et cetera. But what I want to show you about this is the 200th year anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine. I'm a little surprised that there hasn't been much happening on that, but there is it. This is the 200th year anniversary when Latin America became, quote, our backyard. What is interesting is it only becomes our backyard once the Indian Wars and the way to contain African Americans has already been determined by territory in the United States. So we shift from what George Washington called the infant empire to this story. And the reason I'm showing you this cartoon is I know it's hard to see, but if you look at Uncle Sam lecturing 4 children, the 4 children are labeled Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Hawaii. And they're all sitting in front of white children holding books that are labeled with names of the US state. Okay, so this sort of sums up a lot of things here. There's all the kids who are back studying are white. All are boys in this cartoon, no matter who. A Black boy is washing windows. A Native American sits separate from the class by the door. And outside the door, there's a Chinese boy who is looking in. The caption reads this: "School begins. Uncle Sam is teaching his new class on civilization. Now, children," he says, "you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not." And the reason I'm showing you this is that our history is a violent one. It's not just a peaceful one. And those people who believe that organized political violence cannot happen in the United States, unfortunately don't know our history, because it's already happened many times. And that's when you have that kind of history, that worries somebody like me. The other thing that worries me, and I'm talking obviously about my worries about the United States, is what we call forever or perpetual wars. We're not invading Latin America anymore, but we're in Yemen, Libya, Nigeria, and by my count, the United States has been in 28 wars since the Vietnam War. 28. Now, combine perpetual war that history, our ignorance of that history, with the fact that we have now in the last 3 years, an average of 2 mass shootings a day over the last 3 years. We have a rise of 400% of attacks against politicians, almost all of them Democrats. We have a 35% rise in the last year of anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. We have a 44% rise in hate crimes in the entire country. And this is all occurring in a country that is awash with weapons. So you can see the preoccupation, I think. The other thing I want to say is that our institutions, and I kind of failed to say this when I was talking about Hitler, but Hitler came to power constitutionally and electorally, okay? But one of the things that's a problem is that when you create founder institutions at time one, they can turn into very exclusionary institutions in time two. And what we see, for example, in the US Senate, I'll just give you one example, is take 2 states, my state of California and the state of Wyoming. We have 80 times the population of the state of Wyoming, and we both have 2 senators. That is about as anti-democratic as you can get. There's no representation in that story that makes any sense at all in today's world. And finally, I just want to say that when you do surveys, what you see is that the wiring of the United States is quite askew because of the way some of our institutions are. I just mentioned the Senate, but there are others. You can see why I'm worried about violence if you know this story. You can see why I'm especially worried about violence, because there's a very large 2021 survey of attitudes of Democrats and Republicans. And what you find is a surprising number, mostly in the Republican Party, but not entirely, of people who think their opponents, describe their opponents as evil and as subhuman in the United States. So this is very, very worrisome. And the last thing I'm going to say about the worrisome part is that Mr. Trump's rhetoric today is much more violent than it was in 2016 when he was elected president. It's much more violent. And I will just tell you the line he says at the end of his rallies: "They aren't coming for me, they're coming for you." So if I scared you sufficiently, I hope I have. What I want to say is, why am I so optimistic? Because I really believe in what I know Guillermo O'Donnell believed, and I really believe in what Albert Hirschman believed, which is a bias towards hope. And the reason I'm optimistic is the following. And I'm going to end here. First of all, we know so much more than we ever did. We can trace, as I just did for you, how attitudes turn into violence. And when you know how attitudes turn into violence, you know how to go the other way around and you deal with the core value of democracy, which is turning violence into politics. You can do that in the same way that you can describe it, you can prevent it. Secondly, we also know much more about the reform and redesign and content of supposedly democratic institutions. We don't know a lot about that in the United States, but there's a lot going on in Latin America that's really interesting on democratic innovations, and we can learn from that. Thirdly, when you have one party that is turning into is taken over by white supremacists in a 2-party system, that's worrisome. But what nobody's focusing on is what's happening in the other party. And what's happening in the other party in the United States, in a country that has never had or defended diversity of all sorts and demanded protection for all, is we're seeing the Democratic Party becoming possibly our first multinational, real multinational party in history, in the United States anyway. So what I want to point out on that is that partisan sorting and the creation of mega identities is not only a danger, but it's an opportunity. And that's very, very important. And finally, I just want to say to those of you who are watching Chile or some other places right now, that the reason you're seeing the authoritarian playbook is actually a positive one. And it's a positive one because democracy doesn't serve elites in the same way it did when we studied transitions. This is really important. Because of the innovations, because of the reforms, because of the bottom pushes, you're getting elites that are becoming anti-democratic because they can't use democracy the way they did before. And I think that's a very, very important point to keep in mind. Finally, let me just conclude. Pessimism is the defining hallmark of authoritarians. It is the defining hallmark of the right. It is the defining hallmark of those who refuse to acknowledge the kind of progress I showed in one of the earlier slides. It is the hallmark of those who want optimal policies and cannot accept some that are just kind of sort of good. It is the hallmark of people who want to be disappointed in every president and in every leader. But where I live, what I see are organizations and young people that are pushing in a way I haven't seen pushing since the 1960s. And where I live and what I do, I have met the most incredible people, the bravest people, the most persistent, generous, and amazing people who have fought for justice in their communities. And when I meet them and see what they're doing to build their communities against the most incredible opposition, what I think is the extraordinary challenge that we face of turning liberal democracies into diverse democracies is no more extraordinary than what I've already seen on some level. And so I just want to leave you with this words. We are the motors of change. We are the motors of inclusive change because only the hopeful have brought about any change in a direction of deepening democracy. And I hope you will remember that cynicism may be easy, it may masquerade as reality, it may even masquerade as wisdom, but it is the farthest thing from it. Thank you.
Terry, that was absolutely a stupendous tour de force. We covered an amazing amount of ground in that lecture, starting with hopeful wishing about regimes at the macro level, then taking us down into the micro level to literatures that we've often forgotten in the study of democracy, things like political psychology, social psychology, how authoritarianism is expressed at the level of individuals, which is something that we, I think, in political science haven't looked at enough, and how those attitudes can be converted into violence. And the paradox that you ended on is absolutely fascinating. Some of the reasons why elites have become skeptical of democracy is because democracy is no longer simply ratifying everything that they want. And that is an interesting paradox that gives us a bias for hope, taking us back to the Hirschmanian way that you began your lecture. So thank you for that. We have some time, and I know Terry would be happy to take some questions from the audience. Or comments, testimonials, or anything. Do we have a microphone to circulate, or we take this one? Okay. And there's also a comment online that I will take a look at. Can you read that, or?
Probably not.
Okay, I'll read it. I'll read it for you, Terry. A comment online from Paola Balvieso Santillan. Since Latin America has seen a wave of populism in recent decades, at times this populism has opened paths to a more representative democracy, including minorities, migrants, and women. However, as we know, populism can also polarize society, and this can be detrimental to democracy. What are your thoughts on cases like Correa and Ecuador? Are such cases good for democracies or prejudicial?
Is there somebody here who's an Ecuador expert? Just think they might want to answer it more. My problem with Ecuador is my problem with rents, if I can put it that way. It's why I said the Andes, can you hear me? Yeah. The Andes are a problem because when you are dependent on petroleum, and they, that lasts or gas or natural gas, a whole series of relationships grow up around that. I have to tell you that I don't know that much about Ecuador. And I used to know a lot about Ecuador. I was actually in a court case about Ecuador and petroleum. But the thing that I saw in that was a similar network, not as violent, that I see in El Salvador, I have to say, not because of the level of violence, I don't mean that, but the rhetoric of what a person says he's going to do and what he actually does is complicated. And there's no question that in the Ecuador story, there was much more inclusion, particularly of indigenous people. But what I would have to do to know what I think about that really as a bottom line, obviously, I think the inclusion is important. I would have to go, and I would suggest this to the person who asked the question. You have to look at the distribution of rents, number one. Where does the money go? That's really, really important when you're dependent on rents. Where does the money go? Does it go to the military? Does it go to the security forces? Does it go to the indigenous people themselves? Is the way they're using their significant still oil resources something that's destroying their water resources? These are all things for me to give a real answer to that I would have to do. And I apologize that I haven't worked on Ecuador for a long time.
Thank you, Terry. Can I turn to the Congress Program Co-Chair first?
So thanks for the great lecture. I really enjoy. I have a comment question. You showed a graph with this demographic distribution in the US, the development, and I guess we here all agree on this is something constructed. No, it's not a clear cut, to be white, you mentioned the Hispanics, what is to be a Latin? I mean, you are white and many other, I don't know. So my comment is related to how this is framed in the US politics, because we know that the Republicans are responsible for that, they are building that, but what happens with the other side, with their understanding of identity politics? They are not contributing to the same to somehow, and where the notion of citizenship stands in these divisions. What do you think of that?
Did everybody get that question? I think so, right? Okay, there's a big difference whether you live in Texas, whether you live in Florida, whether you live in California, in answering your question. And I'll explain that in a moment. The identities of people who speak Spanish are a huge variety. So it depends if you're coming into Miami as an anti-communist against Chavez or Maduro or whatever, and you hate communism, and that's what you're going to be an engaged citizen on. Or if you come from Mexico and you're coming for a better job and you're not going to engage at all, you're coming from El Salvador where you're afraid to engage at all. You're very afraid, or even Nicaragua in certain ways. There is a lot of fear depending on where you come from and where you go. And so that really affects citizenship and activity. When I showed you these statistics, I forgot to tell you that those are only official statistics. That means everybody that you saw is legal or entered legally. And we have no clue in the United States how many people enter illegally, meaning that they cross a border in some way. And they can be Chinese, they can be Latin, etc. I have a couple of things I would say about that. There are some states who are doing more than others to bring citizenship to Latinos. One of the, and I should say that those states are both of the right and the left, if I can put, I mean, it's not, we don't have much of a left, but when I say they're of the right or the left, it's very important that Florida organizing for citizenship and engagement is very different than what you would see in California. It's just very different. Latins are different. There's a huge variety among them. They don't like each other very much in many cases. And the fact that in my state, people who speak Spanish is the fastest growing group in the United States. People who this year for the first time, mixed race children, meaning different parents from maybe a Latino and an Anglo or a Black person and a Latino or whatever, is greater now in the United States as a group being born today than solely within race people. So that's really interesting too, because that's changing the whole nation of the whole notion of what Latino is. It's also changing the notion of what Black is, by the way, because I think a lot of Black people didn't realize that there were Black Latinos. And I've seen this over and over again, where there's just a big surprise in certain places. I happen to be from Missouri, so there's not a lot of consciousness about these things there. And so answering your question is not a simple one. There is a path to citizenship, or to the green card, at least now. It's way, way, way backed up. So the fact that the way a lot of people became citizens earlier, they can't, or they'll have to wait for 10 years. And so there's no simple answer to that, except both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party see Latinos as a potential support group, depending on where you are. And when I say that, Richard Nixon had a deliberate immigration policy of bringing people into from Eastern Europe, because they were so anti-communist, they were going to all vote Republican. And that is what some people, like the governor of Florida, believes about Venezuelans who come to the United States, for example. That is not what you would find in California again. So I don't know how to answer your question in any way, except we don't know how this is going to shake out. And the Republican Party, for the first time, the Trump Republican Party, is very much trying to recruit minorities. And so when I talked about mega identities as being essentially white supremacist, it's getting a bit more complicated, because you will see, and these are not great numbers, but you will see what some people call, not in my backyard, African-American men, or you'll see Latinos as well. And so this isn't going to shake out as cleanly as one would think.
Thank you, Terry. We have another question online from Annie Wilkinson. I know this is always the toughest question, but what insights have you learned that come to your mind about how to disrupt the process of turning attitudes into violence?
Oh, hi, Annie Wilkinson. If they hadn't let Hitler out, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. I can't prove that. But the Holocaust was something that was created. The move from politics to violence to genocide wasn't gradual. It was not, you could tell what he was going to want to do because he wrote it in Mein Kampf, but that was only in 1923. And when he did that, he had warned people what he was going to do, but people weren't really reading Mein Kampf back then. They started really reading it in the early 30s. So if he was still in jail what would have happened? If you study the rise of the Nazi Party as much as I have, it probably would have been a peripheral party. It depended very much, and this is a way that Hitler was somewhat of a genius. He was extremely disciplined. He knew exactly where he was going and he knew how to get there. Luckily, Mr. Trump is not that way, and we're lucky on that. But let's say, I think the first thing I've learned is, I don't mean this literally, but you cut off the head. You cut off the leadership first. That doesn't mean that everybody will follow, because the stopping of changing violence, of moving violence back into politics, if I can put it that way, is also a gradual process. And so you're going to have all kinds of people who still want to be violent, even if their leader is in jail, even if their leader is being indicted or whatever. They might even get more tightly protective of them. But what we know about how you stop that once the leader is taken care of, and there's steps here, is you then treat people who are in conspiracy theories and who are in what we call QAnon or some of the fake news things that we hear, you treat them as if they were in a cult. And the thing is, and there's a lot we know about how to get people out of cults. They don't just get out of a cult. That's not what happens. If you're a parent and your child is in a cult and you're trying to get your child out of a cult, it's gonna, you have to think in terms of years, not in terms of moments, unless you're extraordinarily lucky. And so I think the first step is the leadership, and you don't let them out if they're going to come back and do something like Hitler did. But the second thing is that you have to treat followers a certain way. The third thing I would say, you might want to see what's happening now. You may want to break certain organizations financially, which is what we're seeing. If many of you are watching what's happening with Fox News, for example, they're paying some very, very big bucks, and they're going to pay a lot more in the next court case. So, and that's what happened with the Ku Klux Klan. That's how the Ku Klux Klan was broken up as a major force in my state, for example. So there are all these tactics that can be done. A lot of them depend, not all of them, but a lot of them depend on the rule of law. The other on how well the rule of law functions in a particular place. But I want to say something else. I listen to a lot of news, and I wish that people who thought, or who are trying to fight for a better US democracy, I wish they would adopt, and I'm talking about my, people in my neck of the woods, I wish they would adopt a kinder tone. I wish they would adopt that it wasn't so nasty. And the reason I wish that is because I think, and I'm not talking about not hitting hard at a leader, but I'm talking about how you deal with your fellow citizens who are MAGA Republicans. You don't have to demonize them, and you don't have to treat them as if they didn't have an identity and some pain in them, if I can put it that way. And I have found that when I do that with perpetrators in court, it's amazing what I get out of them. It's amazing the kinds of things I can use, because I'm saying, I understand why. I don't say this phrase, but you're saying to somebody, I understand why you feel that way. Now, can you tell me if you think this? Or can you tell me what you think? So you ask and ask and ask and ask and listen. And I think that's something that every single citizen can do that wants a better democracy.
Thank you. Terry, we have about 5 minutes left. Would you mind if we collect two or three,
Don't take them.
2 or 3, and then we'll let Terry do her best?
Shall we start? The moderator. Sorry. And you want me to start? Where?
Yes, this is not a question really about, but if you apparently you don't have in your radar the Mexico of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and I would it's recent, I know it's very recent and explainable, but I would advise that we are. And because we are following this playbook as well, some parts of this playbook, of course. In Mexico, with Andrés López Obrador, we are experiencing this authoritarian playbook. That's what I said. And that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. First of all, thanks a lot for your very inspiring lecture. I have one very short comment with regard to the authoritarian playbook. I think there are at least 2 elements that we should mention. One is they are mimicking democracy. Many of these new authoritarian regimes, they are in times of end of history, and there are no other internationally accepted normative models. And so what they are doing very often is they are mimicking democracy, and that makes it more difficult. And the other thing is this playbook has a very important international side. And I think we have to study this international side more intensively than we have been doing it in the last year, because there are not only the bad guys, international networks, but also they are learning from each other. That's why I'm not so optimistic as you are. I know we have to be optimists, but it's not only the good guys who are learning, the bad guys are learning very fast too.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that was the most inspiring, or maybe not, I mean, most inspiring, but maybe not very optimistic lecture, despite your attempts at the end. I want Rita Segato, who is a well-known warrior, feminist warrior and intellectual, I heard her say that of the two of the greatest enemies of Latin American democracy are the mafias and the evangelicals.
Mhm.
And I want to sort of ask you to respond to this point, which is a lot of us do research with evangelicals. And so we observe in politics and indeed in social surveys that the evangelical masses, who are very numerous, of course, exhibit extremely intolerant attitudes and opinions. And yet when we talk to them, they seem perfectly nice people and don't strike me as sort of aggressive or in favor of violence. So do you think that this is a force, like Rita Segato says, or a factor which will undermine and continue to undermine democracy, or even just conviviality? Thank you.
We start with the evangelicals first. I'm really glad you brought up the evangelicals, because I have now learned that there are different kinds of evangelicals with very different feelings about things. And one of the things that's happening in the United States is the splitting of the evangelical movement from a completely Trump-supported position to some groups that are saying this is not Christian. It is not Christian to deal with people that way. I think evangelicals are more complicated than I understood originally. And I also think that in the United States, they are a major background support for MAGA Republicans. And they're also very likely the ones that are Republican to fall into conspiracy and cult theories as well. So that is a concern. But again, evangelicals are more complicated, and they're so, for the first time, we're seeing groups split off, not just in Latin America. There's a new book about this, but in the United States as well, and not being so clear as to where they're going to fall. Now, some of it has to do with the difference of what I talked about between politically engaged and non-engaged people, because evangelicals, at least in some of the communities I know, this is their community. The church is their community, and they will go wherever whomever is preaching to them will go. So, for example, in El Mozote, which I was talking about, which was partly evangelical, partly Catholic, the evangelical church has split. And it is split over its interpretations, has two very different leaders. And one is very much for transitional justice, for all the things that we've been talking about. And the other one is that you will get your reward when you die. And in the meantime, our community will help you. There's a lot of money going into evangelical churches in Central America. It's pretty stunning. The amounts of money that is being transferred there to come up with a more conservative view of how to deal with the situations of violence, et cetera. So that would be my first answer to you. And I think you said something about the mafia as well. I've been talking about criminal networks. They operate exactly like the mafia. It's really stunning. And the question that I think Peter raised was about the internationalization of this. You're absolutely right, Peter. I mean, and I do know this in the sense that I just showed somebody last night a picture that I had taken of, I think he's Saudi, but I can't tell. It's from the back, but it's the way he's dressed. And he's running around Central America. And I go, what's a Saudi doing here in Central America? I mean, there's nothing in the place I was in. It's because there's so much money laundering going on. And particularly in El Salvador, which in Ecuador, I should have said this earlier about Ecuador, they're both on the dollar. And so you cut out a particular way that you can catch money launderers. You don't have an exchange rate, the difference of currencies change. So Salvador is a major center of money laundering, but it's not just money laundering in Latin America. It's not just drug money laundering. There's Chinese money there. There are people who want to hide their money, and they can be Russian, they can be Chinese, they can be Saudis, and then it'll eventually get to the United States as some kind of legal stock form, if I can put it that way. So the problem with that network is it's just so hard to trace. And you can't trace it unless you're in the government, really, or you have those kind of government contacts that will help you. It's very, very difficult. So that, I agree with you, is the internationalization of not just people running around advising you on how to do the authoritarian playbook, but also showing you how to be a criminal and how to move your money in particular ways. So I think that's absolutely correct. And AMLO, ending with Mexico. He's a really tricky sort because he, well, you know more than I do, but in my view, I watch him combine left rhetoric with right actions, authoritarian actions. The playbook can do that too, by the way. I didn't really talk about what the big lie had to be. But what is astonishing in Mexico to me, well, I'll just give you one example, is, and I believe he's an evangelical, isn't he? Yeah. Yeah, he is. He's not? He's saying yes, you're saying no, I don't really know. But what I was it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter for the point I was going to make. What's stunning about him is he clearly isn't ever going to do anything about gender violence. He's not. And about gender violence. He's not going to do anything about gender violence. He might say he's going to do something, but he's not. And so he uses a certain kind of left rhetoric to do things that are not what are identity based anymore. And the other thing I would say is I was just on the Mexican Central American border. And I mean, it's Central America, if I could put it that way. I was using Central America as an example, but the links and the nexus and the fact that everybody knows it and the fact that you cannot get any justice for the kinds of crimes that I was looking at is stunning. So I think your pointing to him is really important, but I also think that we cannot be left and right in the way we used to be. And I think this is super important because it's the mixing of language of inclusivity with making sure that the groups you want to include are actually threatened and killed. It's the mixing of the millennial Bukele and his hats and his style as a young person, et cetera. And his, I'm coming to this town and I'm going to be, everybody's going to have a computer and everybody's going to be modern and everybody's going to be this. And you would think he was on the left, but he's as authoritarian as can be. And so I think that we cannot be the same people we were a long time ago in terms of deciding what's left and right. I think that what we have to decide is what's fair and not fair, what's inclusive and not inclusive, what's democratic and not democratic. And that's where we are right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stay here. Thank you to everyone who joined us here today. And thank you to participants online. Just so you know, it's a really ugly city and it's raining here. So you should be glad you're not here. Thank you, Guillermo O'Donnell, for inspiring all of us. And thanks again to Gabi for joining us from Buenos Aires as well. But the biggest applause should be reserved for our honorand this year, who just treated us to a fantastic lecture. Thank you so much.